Well, a very good evening to everybody and welcome to the university. As it gets lighter, it gets a little bit more welcoming. Coming out of a dark winter, we began our first in this series almost after Christmas. But ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, you're very welcome. I'm especially delighted to welcome our professor's mother and her partner and his parents-in-law who are sitting in the audience somewhere. You're very welcome, a special welcome. And of course, Caroline. Wives suffer alongside their husbands and vice versa, I'm sure. And today we're delighted that we can invite Professor Guy Cuthbertson's family here to the university with us as well. We have a wonderful series of young professors. When I say young, I don't mean age-wise. I mean young professors who grew up with the university and have gone through the hoops. And we celebrate this year a clutch of some dozen of our own professors. We at the university take these very seriously. It's a pretty rigorous process. And for those who end up becoming professors, we like to pause in our annual academic calendar and really to acknowledge the importance of our professors. And of course, I'm delighted especially this evening to be at Professor Guy Cuthbertson's lecture, because Guy has become a colleague and was here when for many years now, and I've seen him develop not only into a professor, as he rightly has done through his publications, but I've seen what an impact he's had on the humanities, and hence now is the head of the School of Humanities, which brings together an important group of subjects. As you know, a university like ours places a great emphasis on the humanities, and the humanities inform all our ethics and all the foundational work of the academy. So I'm delighted to welcome you all. I just noticed behind the mask our Pro-Chancellor. Welcome, Canon Wynne. Always good to see you. So, to begin our evening, I'm going to invite the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Research, Professor Atulya Nagar, to come and introduce our speaker. Professor Nagar.
Good evening, everybody, and may I also extend my welcome to you tonight. I'm delighted to have this opportunity this evening to introduce our inaugural lecturer, Professor Guy Cuthbertson, who has been given a personal chair as Professor of British Literature and Culture within the School of Humanities. Professor Cuthbertson has been with us for some 10 years and has achieved the distinction of being promoted to this chair as a result of outstanding reputation that he has gained in the field externally and for being a valued member of the university community. Just to put some context around this chair, and the Vice Chancellor, of course, in his opening also mentioned, we here at Hope pride ourselves in a rich humanities tradition, and Professor Cuthbertson is the head of that School of Humanities, which is one of our largest schools. At Hope, the process of promotion to professorship is extremely rigorous, and underpinning it are separate judgments relating to the candidate's standing in 3 areas: teaching, research, and overall contribution to the discipline, to the school or department, and of course to the university. Being extremely good in one area cannot compensate for being poor in another. One has to hit a very high standard in all 3. And Professor Cuthbertson does just that. His teaching is consistently rated highly. He is an extremely valued all-round member of his school. Let me, of course, say just a little bit more regarding his research profile and noteworthy esteem indicators from among his many achievements. Professor Cuthbertson has been working for over 20 years on the poetry and prose of the well-known British poet, essayist, and novelist Edward Thomas. In fact, his MPhil and DPhil or doctorate theses at the University of Oxford were on Edward Thomas. And he is a general editor at the series for the series on selected prose of Edward Thomas, published from the Oxford University Press. For this series, Professor Cuthbertson edited its first volume entitled Autobiographies in 2011, and this volume was later chosen as one of the books of the year in the Times Literary Supplement, or TLS. He co-edited jointly with Professor Newlyn the second volume of that series entitled England and Wales, and that was in 2012. And this book again was chosen as summer reading for 2012 in The Observer. Professor Cuthbertson is currently editing a third volume as part of this series, which is entitled Pilgrimages. Along with Professor Newlyn, he has co-edited in the year 2007 a book entitled Branch Lines, Edward Thomas and Contemporary Poetry. In 2018, he was invited to deliver the British Chatterton lecture on poetry, and he chose Edward Thomas as his topic. This lecture takes place every 2 years, and the list of previous Chatterton lecturers is a remarkable roll call of eminent professors, writers, including the Nobel laureate Seamus Heaney. This reminds me that our REF external advisor for the English unit of assessment, Professor Rhodes, commented on Professor Cuthbertson's work, and I quote from that report: "An invitation to deliver the British Academy Chatterton Lecture is one of the highest honors in the field of English studies, and Professor Cuthbertson's lecture has all the qualities one would expect of such an event. It takes a single central theme and uses this both to identify the defining characteristics of a major 20th century poet and to locate him in an illuminating range of contextual or cultural contexts. This is an extremely distinguished piece of literary interpretation and will be seen as world-leading in terms of originality, significance, and rigor," unquote. That lecture, of course, it is also available online for those who are interested. That lecture was then later published in the Journal of the British Academy. Beyond Edward Thomas studies, Professor Cuthbertson has also written a biography published in 2014 by the Yale University Press on the English poet and soldier Wilfred Owen. And again, this was widely reviewed and recognized as one of the top 10 biographies of the year, a book of the week, a must-read, and one of the books of the year. Another of his book, Peace at Last, A Portrait of Armistice Day, was published by the Yale University Press again in 2018, and this book too was Book of the Week in the Evening Standard, one of the Daily Telegraph's books of the year, one of the best books of 2018 in Gulf News, and one of the best books of 2018 in the New Statesman. He is currently writing his third book, again with Yale University Press. Of course, the topic of that is not being publicized yet at the publisher's request, as I understand. Professor Cuthbertson has made a number of appearances on television and has written various magazines and journal articles. In 2016-17 academic year, he was the Ernst Walder Memorial Scholar at Gladstone's Library. Before that, in 2015-16 academic year, he was the Moore Institute Visiting Research Fellow at the National University of Ireland at Galway. I can perhaps take many more minutes and go on and highlight our professor's many achievements, and the list indeed is very long. But in the interest of time, and without further ado, it is now a genuine delight and joy for me to invite Professor Cuthbertson, our Professor of British Literature and Culture, to deliver to us his inaugural lecture entitled A Return to Nature, the Pursuit of the Simple Life. Right.
Okay, hello. Let me begin by thanking the university for this title and for this occasion. Thank you, Atulia, for that introduction, and thank you, Professor Pillay. Obviously, I'd also like to thank all of you for attending today, and some of you have come a very long way, Kent or Hampshire, etc. I think I've also agreed to give this lecture down south some point later in the year in Petersfield, so friends and family down south might get us a chance to hear the second version. I'd also like to thank my wife Caroline, of course, who's here today. I'm going to get emotional, so I will shut up and not talk about Caroline at length, but she obviously is the world to me. I'd also like to thank all of my colleagues who have been very supportive, and in advance I will thank Bill, who will be speaking later on today. What might be called the environmental humanities was also the topic for Stephen Shakespeare's inaugural last week. A wonderful lecture, and I rather suspect I'm now lowering the brow a bit with my own foray into the environmental humanities, so I apologize in advance. Speaking of Shakespeare, in one of Edward Thomas's books, he quotes a poem that adapts Shakespeare's 7 Ages of Man speech into the stages of life at university. The first stage being the freshman, the 6th stage being the professor. The 6th age shifts into the lean and study-worn professor, with spectacles on nose and class at side. His youthful nose has grown a world too large for his shrunk face, and his big, manly voice turning again towards childish treble, pipes and whistles in his sound. Well, I'm not lean, but there we are. I will try to live up to that image of decrepitude. The 7th age is death. So there's always that to look forward to. I'm pleased that the 3rd of March was chosen for today's lecture, because the 3rd of March was the birthday of Edward Thomas, who you'll see up here with his wife Helen. As he wrote, "Here again," she said, "is March the 3rd, and 12 hours singing for the bird." Can I move the slides on, in fact? Oh, yes, there you go. "Here again," she said, "is March the 3rd, and 12 hours singing for the bird, twixt dawn and dusk, from 6:30 to 6:30, never unheard." You can just about see on this slab, which is on the memorial stone in Hampshire, that it's got Thomas's birthday there. It says, "Born in Lambeth, 3rd of March, 1878. And Thomas's lines there are referring to what is actually true, which is today is basically the day where we get more light than dark. Today is the moment in the year which transitions. So I think dawn today was at 6:20 a.m. in Liverpool, and dusk is 6:28 p.m. So by the time, roughly, that I end speaking, the light will have ended. But it's a moment of optimism for Thomas as well. Spring is on its way, more light than dark. It was also, incidentally, my grandmother's birthday, the 3rd of March. She was born on Edward Thomas's 39th birthday, which was a month before he died. What I would like to talk about today is the simple life. By the simple life, we would mean something like living frugally without wealth or luxury or modern technology, with a close connection to the natural world. For many, it would evoke a traditional, now lost, rural way of life. Caroline and I have been dabbling in family history recently and looking at my own forebears, all the branches of the tree way back. Those simple names, Baker, Bloom, Church, Clark, Grubb, house, reed, raven, silver, wing, farmers and agricultural labourers, hardly ever leaving the parish, not straying far, living on and off and with the same land. They had the simple life, century after century, but whether they knew it or cared, I do not know. Looking at them now when they have been reduced to mere names, it is easy to associate them with simplicity. Those ancestors may have stopped during haymaking at Prior's Hardwick or Hedenham and said to themselves, "Ah, yes, I am living the simple life." But to them, perhaps, it was just life, an alternative to death. The idea and that term, the simple life, became particularly significant from the late 19th century onwards, when it could stand in contrast to, or as an antidote to, modern life. By the Edwardian period, when it had become fashionable, the term the simple life was usually taken to refer to the life that was chosen. It was pursued. There was an active decision to live simply. And it was a decision to reject one's own familiar lifestyle, to reject the affluent modern world of one's parents, to go back perhaps to the agricultural world of one's ancestors. It was related to the back to the land spirit that turned its back on the age of progress. Goodbye to the suit, the commute and the office, hello to corduroy, craftsmanship and the cornfield. The simple life was often seen as a cure, a way of recovering from ill health, of the body, but especially of the mind. Self-consciousness, depression, brain fever, brain fag, as they used to call it, conditions Thomas was plagued by. In fact, you might not be able to see this, but this is a postcard, which actually is from 1909, so it's perfectly accurate, which says, "Mr. So-and-so is suffering from brain fag. I therefore order him country air, fresh faces, in fact, an entire change," and you can see the book behind his back, it says The Simple Life. So a very kind of clear point of the Edwardian obsession with this idea of simple life as something a doctor might prescribe. And as such, advertisers found it easy to exploit the simple life when peddling health products. For example, in 1908, Eno's Fruit Salts advertised their product under the line, "The simple life, 'tis luxury that kills," with a quotation from Wagner, "To lead a simple life is to fulfill the highest human destiny." There were stories in the press of miraculous cures, like the man crippled with chronic rheumatism, who was cured by sleeping outdoors at Long Ditton Camp for a month. Indeed, that postcard here picks up on the obsession with sleeping out of doors in this period. Caroline and I live in Port Sunlight, where Lord Leverhulme, one of the wealthiest men in the world, slept outdoors every night on the roof of his massive mansion house, which recently burnt down. There was an obsession with clean air, sleeping out of doors. The press laughed at the simple life, especially some of its cranky habits: health foods, hydrotherapy, free love, eccentric dress, skinny dipping, sunbathing, sandals, and socialism. And you'll get some of that sense from the postcards. There's two little kind of naked children sitting over a fire here with the message, "I'd like to live the simple life with you." Or another one, some men making their Christmas dinner, the simple life, cooking their Christmas dinner. Or they laughed at those with more money than sense, who played at it, but only until the next fashion came along, like Toad in The Wind in the Willows, and amphibian Augustus John with his gypsy caravan and his celebration of the open road. The simple life has been a theme running through my academic career and beyond it. Even Morris, our dog, was named after one of the grandfather heroes of the simple life movement, William Morris. In my biography of Wilfred Owen in 2014, I wrote about simple life themes, including Owen's doctor, Arthur Brock, at Craiglockett War Hospital. Brock offered a nature cure for the shell-shocked, asking, "Are not these horrors of war the last and culminating terms in a series that began in the infernos of our industrialized cities?" Holding that our civilization has become a purely urban one. The city has forgotten the countryside from which it sprang. Concluding that men had become detached from the earth, that modernity and machinery were the true enemies, and declaring, "Let us give nature a chance." For some men, military training even offered some aspects of the simple life, when urban desk jobs and civilian life were replaced with the outdoor life of the soldier. At Hare Hall Camp in Essex, Wilfred Owen was probably taught map reading and orienteering by Edward Thomas. Two pictures of Thomas there. Just the one on the right is in the darkness, but he's standing in a field, and the one on the left is in the National Portrait Gallery. For my Chatterton lecture for the British Academy in 2018, I spoke about simplicity, primarily in relation to Edward Thomas's poetry. Today I would like to focus on his prose, which came before the poetry. And I would like to think about simplicity not in terms of literary style, but in terms of lifestyle. And it's the idea of the simple life, more than the actual phrase, that I would like to focus on. Let's go back to 1909. Sometime during the week of the 17th of March, 1909, sitting at home near Steep in Hampshire, or in the parlour of an inn, Edward Thomas must have read the local paper, the Hants and Sussex News, which was published in the local town, Petersfield. There on page 8, among the usual chaff of a local paper, adverts for chicken feed and cutlery, and reports on the council for this or the board of that, there was an article about the terrible circumstances of the Munday family nearby at Upper Barnes. Thomas later quoted from the article in his book, The Icknield Way, in 1913, where the article inspired a remarkable section of that same book. The headline was Suffering Children at East Meon, Parental Neglect, Severe Sentences, and told of how John and Susan Munday and their relations John and Georgina Dawson ended up in Petersfield Police Court accused of willfully neglecting their children, causing them unnecessary suffering. Thomas knew Upper Barnes, west of Butser Hill, and on the way down Hyden Hill towards East Meon. He loved the broad elephantine back of Butser Hill, likening it to Ararat, though he says, "My unfaithful eyes fail to imagine the ark." Thomas said the barn was almost restored to nature, like a good simple lifer, and the wind there expressed the simple life as ideal, the pure joy of free, active life, contented with itself. Newspaper stories between the 10th and 31st of March fleshed out the tragedy. Thomas certainly saw the paper on the 31st of March, so he knew the whole story. It had been a wild night at the very end of 1908, when John Munday arrived at South Farm with his pregnant wife and their 3 children. Susan was a gypsy hawker, according to census records, and her son Charles had been born in a dilapidated gypsy caravan where the rain came through the roof. Their circumstances had not improved a year later when the Mundays turned up at South Farm and asked Farmer George Atkinson for work and somewhere to stay. They ended up at the drafty barn that was full of holes at Upper Barnes. Munday said he had many times before been in worse places. Upper Barnes was as remote, or pretty much as remote as anywhere in Hampshire could be, an isolated, uninhabited spot, sitting a mile away from its farm. It was a couple of hilly miles away from East Meon, and it was half a dozen miles to Petersfield. It still feels remote today, and there's a few photographs, because Caroline and Morris and I visited Upper Barnes last year. If you can see it. There's Morris even on the right as we're on our way down to Upper Barnes. Morris has a tennis ball there, which he was given by the local gentry who were playing tennis in their garden. He was very delighted by that largesse. It was all beautiful. It was late on a sunny, late summer day, 5:30 in September, not a soul about. The new barns beneath the old trees, the red tractor. If you can see the red tractor at some point. The red tractor put to bed for the night, a bonfire smoking gently somewhere down the lane. It was reminiscent of several Thomas poems, especially the magical tall nettles, where tall nettles cover up, as they have done, these many springs, the rusty harrow, the plough long worn out, and the roller made of stone. But it was hard to imagine the Mundays. As Edward Thomas himself said, there were no ghosts, or so it seemed. But back in 1908, it was a cold Christmas. They all slept on straw. Cattle shared the yard. There was no toilet or kitchen, no furniture. They had one blanket and one quilt. And the only water was the pond where the cows drank. The Mondays tried to get a cottage in the village, but people did not care about letting them in. So the baby, Herbert Sidney, was born in the barn. The nativity story rather haunts the newspaper reports. At the end of January 1909, Edward Thomas's biography of Richard Jefferies was published. It was Jefferies, one of Thomas's heroes, who had declared, "Let us be always out of doors among trees and grass and rain and wind and sun. Let us get out of these indoor narrow modern days, whose 12 hours somehow have become shortened, into the sunlight and the pure wind." Nonetheless, Thomas reflected that he then spent the first 3 months of 1909 sitting close up by the fire all the time, writing all sorts of things. The Mondays, though, were cold and struggling. Thomas probably walked past their barn on the 15th of February when he left his fire and went on a walk over the downs through Clanfield to Westbourne. Perhaps he even met John Monday, later writing in the Icknield Way that "I remember a pale, shuffling man, carrying a child who begged from me monotonously as I came down the hill in mist a little before dark. I had given him something without exactly realizing that he was a man, so frail, subdued, and weak-voiced had he been. A creation of the mist, quite in harmony with the hour." In late February, the Mondays were joined at Upper Barnes by John Dawson, Susan Monday's brother, a recent resident of the workhouse, and he brought his wife and 3 of their children. When Dawson's daughter Georgina became ill with pneumonia, he took Georgina in a, quote, box on wheels over the 6 hilly miles to Petersfield, and the authorities were finally stirred into action. That was Wednesday, the 3rd of March, which was Edward Thomas's 31st birthday. When the NSPCC visited Upper Barnes with a policeman on the Thursday, when, as the papers said, snow was lying on the ground all around, they were shocked by the conditions the 2 families were living in. The children all seemed to be unwell, cold, dirty, and verminous. The 2 Monday girls had measles as well. The Monday's son, Charles, was the worst off. Not only very verminous, after all, they all slept on the same straw in the barn, but also suffering from pneumonia with a rash, a swollen face, and one eye closed completely. The children were taken to the Petersfield infirmary, and the 4 adults were arrested. They were placed on remand for a week, the men sent to prison, and the women to the workhouse. Georgina Dawson said she did not want to be separated from her husband, and then collapsed into an epileptic seizure. I have all of this in my mind, by the way, just because this room where it takes place, the court, is now part of Petersfield Museum, where Jeremy Mitchell's here tonight. He's come from that museum, and it's now attached to the Edward Thomas Study Centre by chance. A week later, the Mondays were given 4 months hard labour each. The Dawsons were given 2. By the time the newspaper article of the 17th of March appeared, the Monday's young child Charles had died on the 15th. Just a few miles away at Berryfield Cottage, where Thomas's own children had been ill that week, although only with chickenpox, the newspaper story caught Thomas's eye. He would turn it into a story about the pursuit of the simple life, changing John Monday's name to Arthur Aubrey Bishopston. Significantly, Thomas makes Bishopston a university graduate. Bishopston, with a second-class degree from Oxford, presumably had the opportunity to be something else, but he chose the simple life. Whereas the Mondays and Dawsons had no university education and lived the life they were born into. Thomas recalls going to the barn soon after the authorities had removed the Bishopstons from it. This is where the story becomes fictional. And he says that he found there Bishopston's notebook. I stirred the bed with my stick, meaning to set fire to it. An old coat was concealed beneath it, and out of the pocket fell a book. That book, a kind of patchy diary, described Bishopston's progress through university and into the barn. The year after leaving Oxford, Bishopston wrote, "Sell all thou hast and follow me." In the same year came the words, "I possess my working clothes and a Greek Testament. I earn 14 shillings a week." Bishopston opted for rural poverty and happily declares that I possess everything, but in the world's sense, nothing but my name. I mentioned at the start of the lecture people being reduced to their names, but Bishopston wants to go further. He wants to lose even his name. If I could lose that, I should be a better citizen, not of the world, but of the universe of eternity. Why should I have a name? Unless indeed there were a name which described me as a poem describes an emotion. I will be nameless. I will no longer condemn myself to this title of AAB. It's a story of a man's delight in owning nothing and living at one with nature, but it's also, of course, simultaneously a cautionary tale. Bishopston does delight in the life. Everything is transfigured. He writes, "It is cold, yes, but the frost is one of the angels." Bishopston echoes his hero Shelley there, and also quotes from his ode to the west wind, "Make me thy lyre, even as the forest is." We do not know whether John Munday saw the world with Shelley's eyes. It seems unlikely. But Bishopston, with these literary quotations and references from Shelley, Blake, and the Bible, as well as elsewhere, gives us the impression that reading helps him to find that happiness in his new life. But at the same time, the Bishopston story suggests some of Thomas's skepticism about formal education, we have to say. It is studying for a degree that drives Bishopston to the edge. University gives him brain fever, and he reacts against it by taking to the land. And how many farmers would trust an Oxford man begging for labouring work? Bishopston is reminiscent of Matthew Wilde's Scholar Gypsy, the Oxford scholar poor who went to learn the gypsy law and roamed the world with that wild brotherhood. And seemingly in winter when snow was falling, like the Mondays and Bishopstons, sought thy straw in some sequestered grain. I knew I was going to get that wrong. Some sequestered grange. There you are, tongue twister. At times, Bishopston also sounds like Thomas Traherne, whose recently discovered prose had such an impact on Thomas. Traherne resolved to move to the countryside after studying at Oxford, to travel round the country, and to live upon £10 a year, and to go in leather clothes and feed upon bread and water. Traherne tells us in Thomas's favourite passage how his childish eyes delighted in everything, and how the simplest everyday things were riches to him. The corn was orient and immortal wheat, which never should be reaped, nor was ever sown. I thought it had stood from everlasting to everlasting. The dust and stones of the street were as precious as gold. The green trees, when I saw them first through one of the gates, transported and ravished me. Traherne believed, as Thomas noted, that education destroyed that early beauty of life, but perhaps Bishopston rediscovered it. Thomas had also recently reviewed the book A Poor Man's House by his friend Stephen Reynolds, stating that Mr. Stephen Reynolds, a man of the middle class with a university training and much reading, has lived with a Devonshire fisherman's family for 2 or 3 years. He has seen the simplicity, the kindliness, the health of it, but also the dirt, the danger, the poverty. In the preface to A Poor Man's House, Reynolds explains that I found there a home and more beauty of life and more happiness than I had met with elsewhere. I have worked on the boats sometimes 15 hours a day, not as an amateur, but for hard and, what is more to the point, badly needed coin. It took the gilt off the gingerbread, but it didn't spoil the gingerbread. Thomas's Bishopston is furthermore a version of Thomas himself. Some of Bishopston's opinions were no doubt Thomas's own, such as the desire to lose his name. Thomas considered publishing his poetry anonymously and eventually adopted the name Edward Easterway. And when Bishopston declares that the road northward out of Arundel leads to heaven, that seems to recall Thomas's own journeying. The weekend after Thomas read the 17th of March newspaper article, he went away walking in Arundel before taking the road northward and walking all the way back home. Thomas was a clever boy who got a scholarship to Oxford, and he could have expected to have had a financially successful life in the law or the civil service where his dad worked, or business. But he had no belief somehow in getting on or bettering himself. He studied history, but his heart was in literature, or even more so, the natural world. In his own book that he wrote about Oxford, which was published 3 years after graduation, Thomas is at his happiest in the college gardens and what he calls the Oxford country. He notes with delight how the countryside inhabits the city. The walls of Oxford are tufted with ivy-leaved toadflax, wallflower, and the sunny plant which botanists call inelegant ragwort. They form a trail from the villages upon wall after wall into Ship Street and Queen's Lane, by which the country may be traced, in the same way the city may be said to steal out into the fields. A college garden, and of course we've got plenty of those here, can be a return to nature. The whole becomes primeval, and it is hard to throw off the illusion of being deep in woods. And just as Bishopston loves Shelley, Edward Thomas's own copy of Shelley from his teenage years is a remarkable botanic object, with quotations scribbled over the fly leaves and dried flowers and leaves pressed between the pages. Highly educated though he was, or precisely because of that education, Thomas, like many of his contemporaries, admired unlettered countrymen, gypsies, tramps. They populate his poetry. Thomas said he wanted to write prose as near akin as possible to the talk of a Surrey peasant. In his book, The Country, Thomas agrees that when a poet writes, he is often putting into words what some little old countryman puzzled out among the sheep and corn in a long lifetime. Thomas also stated that he preferred the old songs All Around My Hat or Summer Is A-Comin' In to Beethoven. He sent his children to the progressive Bedales School, and his wife worked there. At Bedales, agricultural work replaced games. Craftsmanship and farming were equal to any book. The Thomases lived at Steep, a Hampshire village of simple lifers, folk who read The Guardian, were moderate in all things, were teetotal vegetarians. Their simple oak furniture was made by skilled craftsmen, and their curtains were hand-woven. Thomas and his wife lived like that, even though, according to Helen, the genuine simplicity of our life contrasted with the thought-out simplicity of the school people. Helen was actually born in Liverpool on Moscow Drive, and she first met Thomas in London, but nonetheless was just as happy as her husband to leave those cities behind and adopt rural simplicity. At the time of the Monday's tragedy in early 1909, Thomas had just left a brief spell in a London office as Assistant Secretary to a Royal Commission on Ancient Monuments in Wales and Monmouthshire from August to December. That was his one foray into actually having an office job. He disliked it and he quit. Thomas wrote in late 1908 that, "I don't like London. I am elated at the prospect of getting back to Hampshire, especially as in the spring, a friend who has bought 20 or 30 acres at the top of the hill and built himself a house or a workshop. He is an old Bedales boy and makes furniture. He's going to build us a house up there." That house is still there, and a very lovely house it is as well. "How I hate London," he told a friend in November 1908. "No exercise, no air, and continual bellyache and headache and discomfort all over." He admitted that he wanted to be able to stay somewhere alone and not have to work. He was committed to living in the countryside and had no desire to be part of the world of commuting and suit-wearing and pen-pushing. "London was too much for me," he admitted to fellow poet and Londoner, Walter de la Mare. De la Mare, in turn, would say of Thomas that to live in content, a simple life, was perhaps what he desired most of the world, but no man can have less respected the cant phrase. You do see Thomas occasionally using simple life in inverted commas to laugh at the phrase, even though he believes in the idea. London left Thomas almost suicidal. He wrote in November 1908, "How nice it would be to be dead, if only we could know we were dead. That is what I hate, the not being able to turn round in the grave and say it is over. With me, I suppose it is vanity. I don't want to do so difficult a thing as dying without any chance of applause after having done it." He was worried about money, but also reluctant to make it. Thomas was afraid that he would end up like Bishopston, but in many ways he wanted what Bishopston wanted. Society works to make the simple life difficult, impossible even. Money crushes those who do not want to make it. Capitalism destroys its enemies. It was probably during his time in London that he wrote or revised the story called A Return to Nature, which was included in the book The South Country, which he finished in December 1908 when he was in London. An educated Welshman escapes London's suburbia and takes to the land for half the year, working in the office job for the other half. Sleeping outdoors in the countryside and owning nothing is his dream, but he still needs to earn money during his months in London. He manages this for several years, but eventually the double life is unsustainable and he loses his London job. Reading A Return to Nature, there is no doubt that the Welshman made the right choice, though. There is some admirable, enviable optimism. The world is wrong, but the night is fine. The dew light and the moist air is full of the honeysuckle scent. It's a wonderful line of the optimism of the Welshman. And there are some wonderful lines in that story. He went away to wash at the pump as the cattle spread out from the milking stalls into the field and filled it with their sweet breath and the sound of their biting the thick grass. Better perhaps to live with the honeysuckle, the sweet breath of the cattle, the sound of the munching, than to wear a suit, work in an office, or live in London until retirement. Or at least, that is what Thomas felt. Thomas's choice was not as extreme as that Welshman's or Arthur Bishopston's, but that's part of the issue. How far should he go? Having quit London and the office job, should Thomas quit full-time writing and shed his middle-class life altogether? Reviewing and writing books turned country into town. It takes the freedom out of it if you spend all day as some indoor fool stuck in a study. He did consider other jobs. For instance, the writer Norman Douglas planned to set up a small country village shop with Thomas, which is a rather absurd idea, especially if you know about Norman Douglas, who had a rather scandalous pederastic private life and got arrested for it. Anyway, they didn't have the money to buy the shop, so nothing happened. Thomas felt that he was trapped in the literary life. As he said, "I live by writing, since it is impossible to live by not writing in an age not of gold, but of brass." Or as he described in his poem, The Long Small Room, "One thing remains the same. This is my right hand, crawling crab-like over the clean white page, resting a while each morning on the pillow, then once more starting to crawl on towards age." Courage, or lack thereof, was often a theme in Thomas's writing. He wrote a story called Hawthornden, published in 1910, about the man who wants to run away with the gypsies but can't escape his middle-class world and always comes home for tea. Thomas said that of himself. He was always home for tea. Just a few weeks after the newspaper coverage of the Mondays, Thomas had recorded in his diary, alongside the date 6th of April 1909, the words "suicide, brackets, man of action, question mark." This was presumably the autobiographical story that was eventually published as The Attempt in 1910. It's a story about a man, a version of Thomas we assume, who goes off to the woods to take action, to commit suicide, but instead returns home to his wife for tea. It was perhaps the family at home, a wife and children whom he loved, that also prevented Thomas from really pursuing the simple life. I'm grateful to my friend Matthew Bradley, who's here today, for reminding me that in the legendary sitcom The Good Life, the story of the self-sufficient simple life in a Surbiton garden, it's important that Tom and Barbara Good do not have children. It's easier to do these things without the guilt about denying opportunities to children or risking their health. According to Norman Douglas, had Thomas been alone in the world, he might have fared better, since he was a man of the simplest tastes and could live on almost nothing. The tale of Bishopston reveals Thomas's continual anxieties about having impoverished his children and also having failed to take the brave step into a simpler existence. Without children, he could have been braver. He says that Arthur Bishopston should have lived alone and not had a family. Thomas notes, in fact, that Bishopston's unfortunate family, if they had been given to considering such matters, would have said that he ought to have lived solitary and let his hair grow in Wayland's smithy, instead of marrying and begetting 7 children, of whom only 2 were able to die in infancy. So that's a picture of Wayland Smithy, which you might be able to just about make out, basically a lump of rocks. Wayland Smithy is the location of another tale of the simple life, and it is paired with the Bishopston story in the Icknield Way. Wayland Smithy is a Neolithic chambered long barrow near the Uffington White Horse. It's 3 miles from the village called Bishopston, in fact. And I'm going to read out a section from the Icknield Way where Thomas talks about Wayland Smithy and the simple life. Suppose a philosopher were to live in and about these old stones for a year or 2. He might be quite undisturbed. Then he would be arrested on suspicion after some crime. A ploughman would reveal that he had seen the man about. It would reach a pressman with a camera. He would get somebody to pose either in Wayland Smithy or a similar place at Wimbledon or Balham. A column about the simple life would be printed in a newspaper, illustrated by these photographs. By this time, the real philosopher, a hairy and uncommunicative man, would have been released. A rival pressman would travel to Wantage Road with a 3rd-class ticket, which he would call either 2nd or 1st class in his list of expenses. He would assail the philosopher, and with as much grace as is compatible with haste and a preoccupied mind, would bid him describe his experiences in answer to well-chosen leading questions. The philosopher might possibly fail to understand the pressman's object, or even his English. He might seem to refuse. Then the other would produce his card, claiming instant attention as the representative of both the hourly deceiver and the evening tinkle tinkle. This would amuse, puzzle, or infuriate the hairy man. His laughter or his anger would be mistaken for rudeness. The pressman would return to Wantage Road, and in the train invent far better things than ever were on sea or land. And he would have no difficulty in illustrating his article by photographs, which the philosopher would never see. But the people of the neighbourhood would see. Then boys would go up on a Sunday afternoon and stare and perhaps trample down the wheat. A town councillor or a retired missionary or other man of culture would inspect the scene. In the philosopher's absence, it would be discovered that Wayland Smithy was undrained and improperly ventilated. A woman would be scared at a distant view of the philosopher. It would be time for something to be done. Then 1 or 2 things would happen. Either the man would disappear as quietly as mist or as last year's books, or he would be told to go, roused to eloquence or violence, arrested and imprisoned, and his story told in 20 lines in the local paper. From time to time, the police of neighbouring countries would torment him until at last he could be certified as a lunatic. Thomas says, nevertheless, he would have had that 1 year unmolested at Wayland Smithy. A hermit at Wayland Smithy would presumably not even get a year unmolested today. It wouldn't be long before English Heritage or attention on Twitter or Instagram would drive him from his home. Some hermits were luckier than the hairy atavistic fellow at Wayland Smithy. In the same local paper that carried the story about the Mondays, Thomas may have seen a year earlier, in March 1908, a story about the so-called Chesterfield hermit, who lived for 28 years in a little hut. Or the year before that, in September 1907, a story about the hermit of the valley, who lived for 20 years as a mountain hermit in Wales. In an age of such interest in the simple life, the Edwardian press found hermits to write about in every corner of the country. For example, the hermit of Ashton Heath, described as a simple lifer by nature, who lived his hermit life for 30 years in a hole he dug by the roadside. Philosophers who rail at the trivialities and artificialities of conventional civilization, we're told, and preach the return of the simple life, are interested in the case of the umbrella hermit of the Pine Woods, according to the Daily Mail in 1908, referring to Old George, the Berkshire hermit. There was Jeanie, the Penzance hermit, Andrew, the Arbroath hermit, the Windsor hermit, who lived in a nest in a tall elm, the hermit of Peterborough, described as surely a model for devotees of the simple life, the Derby hermit, and a cave-dwelling Hastings hermit, of whom it was said that he is a man of superior intelligence can be seen at a glance. Apparently, about 45 years of age, his tanned features still bear the impress of refinement and culture, his clothes, despite their old-fashioned style, being evidently of a good cut and pattern. Nearer to home, near Southport, James Smethurst lived in a hole underground in the sandhills. And we're told, judging from the amount of literature gathered together in the cave, he had apparently seen better days. The papers loved an educated, middle-class hermit. There's some comedy in this, of course. Again, I'm grateful to my friend Matthew, who sees the entire world through the lens of old BBC sitcoms, for pointing out that there's a 1957 episode of Hancock's Half Hour called The Wild Man of the Woods, which is rather similar to the Wayland Smithy story and that obsession with hermits. Tony Hancock declares, "Civilization has failed us. The only solution is to become a recluse. I'm going back to nature. I shall become a hermit." He moves to Clapham Common because I'll be near the shops. He becomes a destination for tourists, and he finds he has a competitor played by Kenneth Williams. I mean, we can laugh at it all, and we should, but today some elements of the simple life seem necessary. How far should we go? Indeed, for that matter, how far should a university be going? Thomas is thinking through those dilemmas that are ours. Somehow we need to keep on trying, even if we can't make Arthur Bishopston's sacrifice, or can't go away to grow hairy at Wayland Smithy. The interest in the simple life in Britain has obviously never disappeared. Across the century, it has taken all sorts of forms, in different degrees and different guises, involving cranks, crusties, cultists, clean-eaters, con men, and Cotswold commuters. Or indeed, there's a cartoon here from 1932 called Preparing for the Simple Life, showing someone going through their beauty regime before they go out to feed the pigs. And it rose again in new forms during the COVID pandemic, especially during the early lockdown period. Then and earlier, Edward Thomas became for some a writer speaking to the present moment. Indeed, I've spoken before about Thomas's rise, and also contemporaneously with that, the rise of minimalism and simplicity in the world of Steve Jobs, or Marie Kondo with all the world of decluttering that we've seen in recent years. We have the added rather huge issue, of course, of the climate catastrophe. And while we wouldn't want to recommend Arthur Bishopston's fate as a solution to anything, we do need to make sacrifices. And any conscientious citizen is thinking about those choices that they can or should make. Should we ever take an aeroplane flight, drive a petrol car, eat meat, eat processed food, use plastic bags, buy luxury goods, or any number of the less than luxury shops and businesses that are in their own greedy ways wrecking the planet? What technology can we do without? I mean, we're all guilty, and we all know how difficult it is. Now, Thomas's exploration of simplicity is not a response to the climate crisis, even though the journey in the Inaugural Way takes place in 1911, during the record-breaking summer of intense drought and high temperatures, and the heat and the longed-for rain is much discussed in that book. So I've been talking about 1909, but the Inaugural Way, most of it is about 1911, and Thomas inserts into it the Bishopston story, and 1911 was that very hot summer. Thomas didn't connect the burning of fossil fuels to the 1911 heat wave, although we know that at least one commentator did make that connection. So you can find online an article from 1912 in Popular Mechanics magazine, which makes exactly that point, that the heat wave was caused by the burning of fossil fuels. And yet, looking at the Inaugural Way, we have to see the stories of the simple life in the context of the destruction of the natural world. And after all, as Thomas was fond of saying, slightly misquoting Wordsworth, this earth is where we have our happiness or not at all. Thomas and his contemporaries were greatly concerned about the degradation, destruction, and disappearance of the English countryside, especially in the south of England, where the growth of London and its suburbs was unstoppable. This becomes one of the themes of the Inaugural Way, a book which also confronts the new problem of the motor car. The Inaugural Way is a book about a journey by foot along an ancient road from East Anglia into Wiltshire. And along the way, he sees these villages being gobbled up by London. Leagrave has become a safety valve for Luton. At Kentford, motor cars tyrannically owned the road. Only motor cars travelled the road from Newmarket, all passing me as if I needed nothing more but dust to fill the eyes, mouth, nose, ears, shoes, and spirit. Some pictures there, actually, of Inaugural Way today, which make that point. If you're trying to trace the Inaugural Way now, you're going to have to put up with roundabouts and so forth, and plenty of cars. The harsh new streets, as he called them, were cropping up everywhere. Letchworth, he said, is like so many wounds on the earth and so much sticking plaster. It seems a little absurd at one point when in Letchworth, Thomas hears the classic Simple Life tune, "She's off with the raggle-taggle gypsies, oh. What care I for a goose feather bed, with the sheet turned down so bravely, oh. For tonight I shall sleep in a cold open field, along with the raggle-taggle gypsies, oh." Thomas is taking a wider view than just his own happiness, and indeed Arthur Bishopston is trying to change the world in his own strange way. He says, "What name has my beautiful barn in heaven? In it was born a man in the sight of his brothers and sisters. God has told me my seed shall be multiplied as the sands of the sea. Can it be that out of this barn will grow the regeneration of the world? Or will the forgotten memory of it trouble the well-being of some citizen far hence in time, and so give birth to a flame, a prayer, a rose out of the soul of him?" Some citizen far hence in time, he says. Is that us? Can Thomas give birth to a flame, a prayer, a rose? I don't know about that. But when Caroline and I visited Upper Barnes, we were staying in our tent in a field at the Sustainability Centre that is appropriately just round the corner from Upper Barnes now. It seems suitable and hopeful. There we are. There's Morris the dog. There's 2 photos, by the way. He's not massive. He did fit inside the tent. So we walked to Upper Barnes from that tent. Maybe it's all foolishly doomed and a little too late, but a sustainability centre seems as good a place as any to be, and a vision of an achievable simple life. And in that isolated tent, silent but for Morris snoring softly between me and Caroline, I read by torchlight. I read a book called The Utopians, about attempts after the First World War to find a new way of living. That sustainability centre states that our aim is to open ears, eyes and minds, and we hope inspire all to act differently. And sustainability is about treating the earth as if we intend to stay. Thomas might not have been the most optimistic advocate of the simple life. He knows the problems involved. But his work encourages us to think about what it might mean, and how living close to the natural world is its own reward. And what we know and love, we will want to preserve. Ultimately, what stays with us in these stories is Thomas's love and knowledge of the countryside, and the fact that if we are to preserve the countryside, we must consider simplicity. Is that 6:30? The simple life is difficult, but we shouldn't forget the cheery farewell of the Welshman in A Return to Nature, accompanied by a photo here taken by Edward Thomas himself. "Forget my night thoughts," he said, "and be thankful for the white, dry road and the blue sky. We are not so young, but that we must be glad it is summer and fine. As for me, the dry weather is so sweet that I like the smell of elderflower and the hay-cart horse's dung and the dust that get into the throat of an evening. Goodbye." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Guy. Giving the vote of thanks in response to the lecture today is Professor Bill Blazek, a colleague from our English team. Professor Blazek.
I think it's fair to state that if it weren't for me, Guy Cuthbertson would not be here this evening. You see, I'm the one responsible for shortlisting him for a lectureship in English literature in 2012. Now, although I'd like to take credit for anything in his career that happened after that moment, I have to admit that since then, it's all been down to him. To his talent and devotion to work as a literary critic, biographer, and editor, as a public advocate of especially English poetry and literary history, as an engaging, inventive classroom teacher, and latterly as head of English and as head of the School of Humanities. In that capacity, it turns out that he's technically my line manager now. So it's possible that I might someday have to remind him that the term line manager comes from the whaling industry, in which the line manager was the person responsible for making sure that the rope line attached to the harpoon didn't become tangled and drag down the crew of a whaleboat into the deep blue sea. I'm confident that Guy will continue to perform a seaworthy service to our school's academic and administrative staff with the focused energy that he has given to his long service to the legacy of Edward Thomas. Yes, Guy has published on other writers and events too, including a widely and favorably reviewed biography of Wilfred Owen that led to a speaking tour across what I think was at least half of Europe, and his first major television appearance on a special Songs of Praise program on Owen, followed by an extremely well-timed publication entitled Peace at Last, a book about the day of the November 1918 armistice and the myriad of different reactions across the country to that sorrowfully joyous day. A book that gave him a seat next to David Dimbleby for the BBC coverage of the 2018 centennial commemorations at the Cenotaph. Now, I don't know if Guy's work on Edward Thomas will ever result in further celebrity media appearances, but in a way that would be fitting if it didn't, thereby allowing Guy to settle into a quieter life, away from the TV spotlights, returning to a simple life in Port Sunlight and Hope Park, where, as on this evening, he has the perfect environment to explain what Edward Thomas wrote about and how he lived. Thomas followed a path that was taken earlier by the English arts and crafts movement led by William Morris and inspired in part by John Ruskin. Taken as well in the diverse back to nature Lebensreform movement in late 19th and early 20th century Germany, and the related Wandervogel, the wandering bird hiking and camping groups that sprang from a reaction to modern industrialization and urbanization. You won't be surprised if I mention a famous American precursor also, the Harvard-educated Henry David Thoreau, who in his book Walden, or Life in the Woods, describes his 2-year experiment living in a 10 by 15-foot cabin that he built himself on Walden Pond, a mile outside of the village of Concord, Massachusetts. Thoreau explains, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." His experiment in simple living and high thinking, in pursuit of transcendental insight, starts by showing how one could, at least in the 1840s, easily provide for the basic necessities of life: food, clothing, fuel, shelter, with a little creativity and DIY skill. Thoreau declares his philosophy for living well: simplicity, 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 with an exclamation mark at the end. In a more interconnected and increasingly populated and mostly urbanized Britain by the 1910s, Edward Thomas not only faced the dominant social pressures to conform to the machine age, but also, as Guy has shown, Thomas had direct knowledge of rural poverty, along with an irritating awareness that ideals must be compromised if one is a well-educated Englishman with a wife and children to consider and no fortune to relieve him of family responsibilities or to free him from the grind of writing for pay while remaining true to himself and his convictions. Guy's own introductions to and scholarly editing of Thomas's prose writings as general editor of the 5 Oxford University Press volumes now in print, with another forthcoming, and as volume editor and co-editor himself, have given the world an entirely new perspective on the man most readers will know only mistakenly as a First World War poet. You've been shown in his lecture some of the qualities of style, technique, and careful research that have gone into Guy's work on Thomas's oeuvre, such as the details about the Munday family at Upper Barnes, gleaned from newspaper accounts and census records, or uncovering the origins of the character's name, Bishopstone, or the stories to be found in the Edwardian press about the Chesterfield hermit or the hermit of Ashton Heath. We have also heard a flavor of Thomas's clarity of style in our new professor's own phrasing, such as, the paper's loved and educated middle-class hermit, or hello to corduroy, craftsmanship, and the cornfield. I noticed your fondness for alliteration. Or, without children, he could have been braver. I urge you all to read or listen to the audio recording of Guy's Chatterton lecture, easily found on the British Academy website. It's 34 pages of a brilliant analysis of Edward Thomas's writing. Arguing against received academic wisdom, that lecture states, his prose moved towards plainness, and his poetry is beautifully simple. In a 21st century world of technological dependency, Thomas's example might not guide us into a more sustainable environmental future or solve the problems of urban homelessness or rural hardship, but perhaps his writings and his life story can provide some hope. I'm grateful for Guy Cuthbertson's dedication to the task of resurrecting and explicating those writings. And on behalf of the Liverpool Hope community, I congratulate him on his appointment as Professor of British Literature and Culture. And now you can see I was right in my headhunting role 10 years ago when I anticipated this day from the start.
A prophet among us. I'm grateful, Bill, for you reminding us about line manager. Now I know why I don't like the term. But thank you for that affirming word as a colleague. And Guy, I think much of behind that was some affection, as we all feel for you as a colleague and your support for a wonderful team of humanities scholars. And it's a wonderful thing to have you as a colleague here at this university, and reminding us again, and thank you for the link with Toro, how we can learn to live deliberately, one way or the other. Would you come forward and accept a little gift from us? We normally give you a little memento to remember this evening. It's my great pleasure to give it to you. Thank you very much. Why, if you want to, bring it first. Yes.
It's a selection box.
You want to do it?
Oh, very good. Thank you very much. It's a glass plastic. There we are. Thank you.
With COVID and everything around us, let's find a way to greet Guy, and if Caroline would like to join him at the door, we'll just sort of space it out and don't gather too long around the corner. Put your masks on and let's look after each other. But what a lovely evening, and thank you, Guy.